thank you very much for the fascinating presentation. Generally, I work at Cleveland Institute as well. I had liked to be here and listen to your presentation today. Last week, I was in Edinburgh, and John Ikenberry was talking there, and he talked about the liberal international order as well.
Right.
As everybody probably knows, is one of his things, his thing. So there was a lot of talking about the problems that the liberal international order is facing nowadays, and the names of Farage, Trump, Le Pen were repeated quite often. What is missing here, the kind of elephant in the room, is a discussion, a debate of the shortcomings, significant shortcomings of that order itself. So these people, and you mentioned it, you said Trump is a symptom of something, some dynamics that precede him. So why do you think there is not a proper debate about the shortcomings of the liberal international order? What kind of problems led us to the situation to where we are today with all this nationalism, populism rising in international relations?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, first of all, I hope that the spirit of my remarks, if not this precise content, conveyed my basic view that there are real shortcomings that we do need to fix. There are shortcomings in the approach of American foreign policy, and there are shortcomings in the system of rules that are out there. And so on the liberal international order, let me just start by saying, for those of you who are sort of like, I kind of know what that is, but I'm not sure. From my perspective, the liberal international order is a system of rules, institutions, and alliances that was built over the course of the last 70 years to do basically three things: to try to prevent or manage conflict, to set down rules that govern the conduct of states and non-state actors on key issues, with the economic realm being a core part of it, the IMF, the World Bank, the open global trading system. And then third, to mobilize cooperation on issues that affect most or all countries, but that no one country can solve on their own. So it's managing conflict, it is setting rules for types of conduct, and it's trying to mobilize cooperation. That and the core elements of the liberal international order are an attempt to have some form of collaboration, some form of, so collaboration on the problem-solving side, an open, transparent, free, and fair international economic system, with both with respect to trade and finance, and then a set of political and security institutions that generally point towards greater human rights, greater political modernization, but don't necessarily, but can sort of accommodate, in my view, different types of political systems. So why is it, you can understand why a country like Russia or China might have questions about this system and their role in it and what they want to do about it, and we can come on to that. But your question is more about why do the people in Europe and the United States think this thing isn't really working for me? You mentioned John Ikenberry, another famous Princeton professor, Robert Cohane, and another father of this style of thinking of sorts, a little different, same style of thinking, recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs magazine titled "The System is Rigged." And he was talking about the liberal international order. Why? Because if you look at the performance of our international economic system over the course of the past 30 years with respect to middle classes in the United States, in the UK and other places, hasn't worked out so great for them. Now, we can debate the extent to which this is more about trade or more about automation or what have you, but fundamentally, we've operated at 30,000 feet in thinking about the nature of our open international economy, and we haven't thought sufficiently about who are the winners and who are the losers, and what are the ways in which the economies that we've built are not delivering results for people. So that's one big piece of it. And part of the reason I said the first order of business for US foreign policy is to put the middle class back at the center of foreign policy decision making is I think we've been on autopilot on that set of issues because we've just assumed that that's all taken care of by this great system of economic rules that we've set up that clearly are the best way to go about doing things in the world. So that's one thing. The second is that from the perspective of basic issues of identity and what people think of as what their country should look like, who they are as a people, something I mentioned earlier in my remarks in the United States, and this applies in Europe as well. That's being pressured and challenged by the freer movement of people, both voluntary and involuntary. And I think that's having a dramatic impact as well, as people look around and say, I don't quite recognize this society anymore. That can translate into racism and xenophobia and all kinds of terrible things, but underlying it is something that has to be contended with and has to be responded to. And we're dealing with that very profoundly and directly in the United States. Europe, in an even more pressurized situation, is dealing with it, and we saw the results of the German election recently, where this was a really significant factor. So those are a couple of the things. I think for the US, there's this added dimension of these wars that I can't say that they've made people weary, because such a tiny percentage of our people have actually been directly affected by them, fought in them, or had family members fight in them. But it has made people feel like this just isn't working. It's not working. You know, we went and spent all this money and all these lives, and for what? That's probably a less prevalent factor on the other side, this side of the Atlantic, but very much there in the United States. So do we need to think about the ways in which we improve upon the basic system of rules and institutions and alliances to do a better job of responding to the needs of real people? We absolutely do. Why is that conversation not happening? I think in part it's not happening because the critics, Trump and Farage and Le Pen, are so easily dismissed for other reasons that it's like, why listen to them at all? These people don't pass a kind of basic moral test in a way. So we don't have to inquire ourselves about whether underlying what they are saying are very real questions that we need to contend with. And I think that that is to our discredit, that we are not taking on the substance, not of their critiques, which I think ultimately fail, but of what's behind them, what's behind their critiques. And part of what I was trying to do today and what I'm trying to do in grappling with the results of this election is exactly that.
There's one out here and two here. I thought you were first.
Yeah, you said that when you were on the campaign trail, you used the phrase liberal international order, and somebody said that they didn't like any of those. How do you talk to people who aren't part of like an academic setting?
Yeah.
How do you change your rhetoric so that it's not just talking to like the liberal elite?
Right. It's a great question. I mean, it's a question I struggle with. If I had a decisive answer to it, I probably wouldn't be standing here tonight. I'd be otherwise engaged. So I have to, admit some humility in trying to get at that. But one of the things that I have found I've asked a lot. I grew up in Minnesota, which is in the Midwest in the United States. My mother's family's from Wisconsin. And I've spent a lot of time talking to people in the Midwest and elsewhere, some of whom were Trump supporters. What about this idea of the United States playing a leadership role in the world, stepping up on the great global challenges of our time? Isn't that exciting? And what I have found is that when you put things in more concrete terms, when you spell out both what would befall us if the United States said, you know what, we're closing up shop and we're no longer working on whether it's climate change or nuclear proliferation or pandemic disease, or investing in places so you don't get huge refugee crises, and just getting specific about that. I mean, let's just take nuclear proliferation as one example. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1963 is not a good place to start on the campaign trail. But the idea that 20 or more countries could end up with nuclear weapons and a nuclear war would be more likely, and the prospect of nuclear weapons falling into the hands of terrorists that end up in an American city would be more likely, that's something people can understand. So should we invest a little bit, maybe, to try and rally the world to lock down loose nuclear materials and stop other countries, especially countries who don't like us very much, from getting nuclear weapons? That sounds like a pretty good idea. I think we have to take this from things where people are talking about interests, values, liberal international order, down to the concrete. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I think we need to look at the economic side of this dimension as well, because it's not just transnational issues that are at play right now. We have had the return with a vengeance of great power competition. Russia, US, China, US. That is there, that is present. Now, why does that matter to ordinary people? We have enough trouble right now in dealing with Chinese economic policy in ways that affect workers in the United States. If we retreat from the world and Chinese influence only grows dramatically in our place, how much easier is it going to be to deal with them, to stop them from these abuses and these kinds of practices? It's going to get a lot harder. So let's be engaged. So, you know, I'm answering your question a little bit through example rather than through a framework, but I basically think that we have taken so many of the fundamentals for granted in the US for so long because Republicans and Democrats basically agreed on these fundamentals that we have forgotten how to just go back to basics. And I think when you go back to basics and you really get at it with people, you end up in a place where they are more willing to listen. And from my perspective, that is a big part of what we've got to do in the United States over the next 20 years. And simply huffing and saying, well, you don't know what you're talking about, it's always been this way and it has to be, is not going to get the job done.
Just following up on that, was the kind of reaction to this liberal democratic order a rejection of that, or was it more, as we said, more messaging? How much did beliefs in Americans, the simplistic messaging of America first or bringing jobs back, how much did that play into, as opposed to an actual rejection of where we were?
Yeah, I don't think this election rose or fell on foreign policy. So I'm not arguing that, you know, the American people looked at Trump's rejection of these three premises and said, okay, that's why I'm going for him, as opposed to because he's against the immigrants who are stealing my jobs, which I think was probably the dominant factor in the minds of the voters who were deciding at the last minute. So I think messaging mattered, and I think other issues more core to identity and you know, kitchen table economics drove things. But I don't think that should make us say all we have to do is just explain things better or message better, because I do think, for the reasons I laid out, it requires policy adjustment as well. I actually think we are not going to be able to sustain an effective policy. We're not going to be able to win the argument, no matter what our messaging is, if we're not giving people a more credible answer on use of force, on how their economic livelihoods are going to be enhanced by what we're doing, on why they should continue to think that values should play a central role in what we were doing, and on the other factors that I discussed. So a big part of what I've come to, I used to think all we got to do is just get better at the packaging. Now I believe we got to get better at the policy. And that's on us to figure out how we do that going forward.
Hi, thanks very much, Tim O'Connor. Thanks, Jay. This is fascinating. I have to admit, first of all, I'm a complete nerd. My first experience of American presidential politics was as an 8-year-old in 1960 down in West Limerick, when our teacher was writing up on the blackboard, had built up all that had written in all the states, and was chalking in overnight, you know, which states had gone overnight to Nixon, which had gone to Kennedy.
Yeah.
They couldn't wait as an 8-year-old to get in the next day and say, what happened, sir? That's how far the world has come on. That's all that. Anyway, this is fantastic. Thank you for your very clear outline to us on what is, you know, a lot of nebulous and complex things interacting. As somebody who spent most of my own career working for the Irish diplomatic service, including a couple of times in the States, I'd like to ask you a little bit about how much of this is about the fact that America, this great land where our people have been going for generations, in fact, which was always the land of incredible opportunity and, in fact, the land of the American dream, which our people have experienced over, you know, decades and how much, to what extent is, in fact, what we're seeing is the dying of the American dream and the ability of generations to be able to be more prosperous than their parents and so on. And actually, America, in some kind of way, you know, 260 years later, whatever the number is becoming just like another country. And therefore, that kind of always looking to the future, that hopeful thing, and it's a bit, the extraordinary success that you've achieved as a country technologically in every kind of way, that is starting to slow, and now, and that is of course affecting foreign policy as well, in all these ways. And the other ironic factor, even though Donald Trump is of course very much about America first and looking inwards, his greatest weapon, which we haven't talked about tonight much yet, is actually is the global one, which is mass communications.
Yeah.
His extraordinary ability to capture the ability, to be able to communicate directly in a way that has never happened before. That Kennedy-Nixon one was a breakthrough in 1960 because of television. But this Obama to a certain extent, but I mean, obviously what Donald Trump is doing now every day. And I just wonder to what extent, ultimately, finally, is this really about that interface between the dying of the American dream in some kind of way and economic decline, that the actual biggest impactor in what has happened is in fact the recession. People losing economic. So it's just those are the pieces that are actually playing in here, and that of course is affecting American foreign policy.
So it's a great question. And I actually lie awake at night wondering, could the answer to that question be, in fact, we don't have what it takes anymore because of some combination of factors, both self-inflicted and imposed from the outside. I do not ultimately believe that that is the case. I do agree with the last thing you said, which is that the Great Recession loomed very large in 2016. And it's a funny thing a bit in American politics, because there was an election in 2012 as well, and one might have thought that a lot of this would have gotten played out in that election, much more proximate to the crisis, the way that things played out here in Ireland in 2011. But that was an election that pitted Barack Obama against Mitt Romney, and Mitt Romney was not going to be the populist tribune of the people talking about how finance is bad, given that he was a private equity guy, representing Bain Capital. So there was a deferred barbaric yawp, in a way, coming up from, and by the way, I'm not calling the American people barbarous in that. That's a turn of phrase. Okay, maybe an infelicitous turn of phrase. So, in 2016 as a result. But on the question of American decline, I'd say three things. Number one, the United States maintains all of the basic capacities to solve our problems if we choose to do so. Now, big question, if we choose to do so, and I'll come to that in a minute. We have the wherewithal from the perspective of economic dynamism, a young mobile population, natural resources, continuing basic security, and innovation advantage. All of it. It's all there. There's no inherent objective factor that would have you say the United States is now going to become just like any other country in the world. So that's number one. Number two, this question of American decline arises periodically. Maybe every decade it arises in a way. In the 70s, it was about stagflation and the oil embargo, and the Carter years were on our way down. In the 80s, it was the Japanese who were going to come take over the world, and the United States can't compete. Now we have a new version of this. Is this time the real time, given everything going on in the world? I do believe that the combined factors of automation, globalization, and this core question of where the good jobs of the future come from, these are vexing issues that we've not solved yet, but I believe we do have it within our capacity to solve them. I'm not saying we will, but we have it within our capacity. That leads from capacity then to will. Do we have the will or the wherewithal to actually do these things then? And here I would quote Lee Kuan Yew. So Lee Kuan Yew, the founding president of Singapore, and sort of the wise man of Asia for many years, who passed away recently. But when I was working for Vice President Biden, we went and saw Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. He was quite old, but still completely lucid. And Biden said to him, "What are the Chinese up to right now? What's your take on what the Chinese are up to?" And Lee Kuan Yew, without missing a beat, said, "Oh, that's easy. They're in America and they're digging." And Biden said, "Well, they're digging for what? Or what do you mean they're digging?" He said, "Yeah, they're digging for the black box." Biden said, "The black box?" I said, "Yeah, they're digging. They're trying to find the black box where you've hidden the secret about how you, as a people, can reinvent yourselves. And they're trying to find it." And it was, it was a kind of a clever statement in a way, but I think that there was something in it. I do believe that the United States has a capacity for self-correction and reinvention that allows us to be able to hit turbulence, fall backwards, but ultimately continue on the march of progress. And on the American dream question specifically, there is no doubt that where you are born in the United States, at what income level, what the color of your skin is, whether you're a man or a woman, all these things have a big impact on your success in life. And there's no just like anyone can make it no matter what thing going on right now. We got a lot to do to work on that. But I actually believe as you look at the generational changes in the United States, as you look at demography, as you look at innovation, that we can restore some of the core elements of that and build new ones because, of course, the American dream never included everyone throughout our history. And so I remain, as I said, a long-term optimist. We're going to have to weather this period. But I actually believe in a way that Trump has awakened something in the United States that will be converted into the kind of positive, proactive policymaking that will get us to where we need to be. If I'm wrong, well then we're screwed anyway. But if I'm right, then I will have predicted a very good future. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Slightly a great place to finish. We're not going to because there's more questions. Yes, hi.
Hi, I just wanted to pick up on something that the previous questioner asked, which is that the new interface between politicians and people. You mentioned at the end of your talk, you said something that was quite striking, which is that foreign policy is about imperfect people making imperfect choices. In other words, it's complex. And I wonder how, I realize that it's not all about the message, but Donald Trump really managed to capitalize on, this new kind of social media, the 140 characters of Twitter, etc. How do you tailor what is unavoidably a complex message when it comes to international relations to these new platforms such as Facebook, which obviously feed people, news that they want and based on things that they want to hear. How do you tailor a complex message to, ever shrinking platforms?
Basically, I can admire this problem. I can look at it, see how real it is, and I don't have a good answer to it. Robert Kaplan, who's a well-known American foreign policy commentator, said recently of our democracy that, and of just generally democracy in general, maybe it's a pen and pad enterprise. Maybe it's actually not well suited for the digital age, because what these platforms have done is not just force the distillation into things so simple that they strip all of the meaning out of hard policy debates, not just foreign policy debates, but domestic policy debates, but they've also pushed people into circumstances where they're basically only listening to people they already agree with and reinforcing their points of view. And how do you have a successful democracy when a combination of segmentation of the electorate into different communities that agree within one another, of simplification so that people can't really understand the trade-offs of what is happening, and maybe most problematically of people being distanced from the personal with one another and the community bonds being frayed so that we can just viciously attack one another. You go on Twitter and you look at your mentions at, I go on TV from time to time and I make the mistake of then looking to see how people reacted to it on Twitter. And people have made up adjectives I've never even heard of that are super mean. I try to pretend like they're nice, but I kind of pick up from context that they're not so enthusiastic about me. It's just nasty. And so if you did nastiness, and so that's me admiring the problem at some length. I don't have a good solution for it, but I actually believe that if we are not capable of figuring out as a democratic polity in the United States, in Ireland, and other places, then you're only going to see the hardening of the political divides and the kind of overall dumbing down of our political discourse in ways that are deeply distressing. I wish I could say, here are 3 things that we could do about that. I believe that we're at the front end of a conversation about it. I think more people are putting more resources and more brain power and energy into solving this problem, and I think that that is all to the good.
Okay, it's obviously a huge problem. We didn't even mention the role that Russia took advantage of in relationship to what we're talking about as well. And there's a lot more discussion on that, I'm sure, to be had. But we have one or two more hands. Hi.
Hi, I'm just curious. During the Brexit referendum, some members of the Tory establishment dismissed experts. I wonder, and it also portrayed in the United States as well during the Trump campaign. Two questions. Does that attitude worry you, and how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so we have really, a guy named Tom Nichols wrote a book called The Death of Expertise, where you know, he essentially diagnosed this challenge in modern society where, you know, people just distrust and discount what the quote-unquote elite or the quote-unquote expert class has to say about things. Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And I think the ethos today is, heck yes, we're entitled to our own facts, or at least we're entitled to reject facts that we find inconvenient or disagree with by rejecting the person behind them. And we saw this play out in the United States in spades. And actually, the press was somewhat of an accomplice in this. I mean, they tended to deride Hillary Clinton for all of her carefully constructed policy papers that had, you know, information that actually backed up what she was arguing, and gave a free pass, I think, to a large extent to both Sanders and Trump, who put forward, you know, sort of, in some ways, ludicrous propositions around certain issues. I actually don't, I think this is a constant tension in democracy. I don't actually believe that we've entered a fundamentally different phase. I think there's always been a kind of tension between popular will and people who don't have time because they're working hard and they're raising kids and so forth to learn everything, and not wanting to just buy hook, line, and sinker what the, you know, people in establishments like this have to say to them. So I actually think we just need to think harder about how we navigate that tension and not think of it as some new thing or a secular trend that's going to mean that it's just going to be ruled by mob or mass. That may be wrong, but fundamentally, the inner wonk of a society comes out when big policy debates come to the fore. So in the United States, for example, we've just come through this extensive healthcare debate, and the American people now are intimately familiar with protections for pre-existing conditions, state exchanges under the Affordable Care Act. They like, this is the discourse actually on these issues was such that I think when push comes to shove, this tension ends up getting resolved, and there's plenty of room for experts to continue. But yes, will they be punching bags in elections for, you know, the foreseeable future? Yes, they will.
People are thinking, I just want to throw one in.
I think there's
Oh,
one
sorry.
more.
Yes, we do. I didn't see your hand. Hi. We've got a mic.
Hi, thank you for speaking tonight. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that in answer to the gentleman's question over there, the United States should find its way technologically through innovation, through enterprise, its way forward, and what's to come. Just one thing missing there is electorally. The people's will has been thwarted now, the popular people's vote in 2000, which led to Iraq, which, you know, no matter what people thought when they were voting in 2000, I don't think our stance would have been the same, obviously, if Al Gore was elected, and of course now in 2016. And this is written about quite a bit, is we're now getting tyranny of the minority. About 20% of the population is electing 50% of the US senators. And we're looking at the real possibility of, in 2018, that the party that gets 55% of the national vote will lose seats in the Senate and probably won't retake the House. How do we get the electoral institutions, which can often lead us to a better place? They've obviously affected our foreign policy stance, how domestic politics does to that. I think that's a great shortcoming you didn't address, and I just like to...
Yeah. No, thank you for raising that, and I think your numbers are spot on. So In 2000, obviously Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than Donald Trump and lost the election decisively in the Electoral College. In 2016, Republicans got 49% of the nationwide vote for the House of Representatives and got 55% of the seats. So Democrats could be +6, +7 in the next election and still not retake the House of Representatives. That's pretty extraordinary. And that does, and when you add to that measures to suppress the voting rights of citizens and the whole campaign finance issue, which is just an extraordinary additional barrier and warping factor in American democracy, we have huge problems. I think a big challenge over the past 20 years is that folks who I would consider sort of like-minded, people who believe in sort of a progressive, more just democracy, economy, et cetera, have been very focused on issues and not on process. I've been focused on solving the challenge of climate change or dealing with immigration or dealing with tax reform and not on the rules of the game. Meanwhile, folks who I would consider to be retrograde and regressive have been deeply focused with their pocketbooks and their energy on the ground in rigging the rules of the game. There's a reason why Republicans have this advantage. In the Electoral College, it's in the Constitution, but in the House of Representatives and the Senate, it's winning state legislatures and then being able to gerrymander. So I think this last election was a wake-up call, and if you look at the amount of resources that's now being put in to try to deal with voting rights, campaign finance, and redistricting, I predict to you that a decade from now, the landscape will look considerably better than it does today. I think this is a generational project or more to really, completely fix. In some aspects, like the Electoral College, in my view, will never be fixed. But for the rest of it, I think we can make major progress because I think people are finally focused on it for the reason that you just said. And I believe the candidates coming forward and running on these kinds of platforms are increasingly going to be able to appeal to people who recognize the system's rigged, it's broken, it's not working for them. So I retain some confidence on this issue as well, at least in respect to dealing with the gerrymandering in the House, the Senate, state legislatures, and with respect to the overall issue of voting access, voting rights, and the like. And I think that will bring the popular will closer in conformity to the election results. But I'm not going to say that I'm totally satisfied with the Electoral College remaining in place given the result it produced in 2000 and the absolutely absurd result it produced in 2016 where Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes and still lost.
Very question on a little bit. You talked about the problems that are facing American politics very generally here. What about whether the Democratic Party in particular? The election was surely traumatic for the Democrats, not just for Hillary Clinton, but across the board. What do they need to do and who needs to do it?
Well, on the who needs to do it, that's I'll take the fifth on that one because we will, we have an increasing stable of really good voices. I think the thing the Democrats need to do, first and foremost, is strike the correct balance between holding Trump accountable and putting forward an alternative positive vision. And by strike the right balance, I mean there's a lot of people now saying, it can't be all negative towards Trump. You've really got to make it more about what are you for. I buy that, but only to a certain extent. I think holding Trump accountable and driving a narrative about his manifest shortcomings, failure, and unfitness for office has got to be a central part of our message going forward, and it has to be unrelenting and unforgiving. The Republican Party decided the day after Barack Obama was elected president that they were going to spend every day trying to push back against him. And I don't think it would be wrong for the Democrats to have an aspect of that as part of their policy, or we're not going to be successful, on the one hand. On the other hand, that alone is not sufficient. And where I think the Democrats need to find the right balance in terms of their affirmative message is not to get trapped in this, should it be identity politics or should it be, bread and butter economic messages? It's going to have to be both. The Democratic Party represents a variety of diverse constituencies and needs to speak for them. and for the values that we hold. It also has to talk to working class white voters in America once again. And the right way to do that is to tell a story in which everybody can see themselves. I think I frequently contributed to speeches and talking points in this last election that properly held up values of equality and justice and liberty for groups of people, but didn't do enough to say, here's how everybody fits into this picture. And I think if Democrats can crack that code, then we can actually generate a sustainable majority for a long time to come. But I worry what's happening instead is we're stuck in a debate. It's like, let's put all these identity politics issue to one side and only focus on economics. I find that debate to be not just unrealistic because it's not going to happen, it can't happen, but also unwise because it has us sort of turning our back on many of the core principles and values that define who we are as a party. So on the affirmative side, we have to get that balance right, and then we also have to get the balance right between the affirmative and the contrast against Trump and against what he's trying to do, and not give up on that and not be cowed into thinking, well, really, people don't want to hear it anymore with the negative on Trump. No, they need to hear it because, in my view, what this person is doing to our country is deeply damaging, and what he's doing to working families, ordinary Americans, the country over, is deeply damaging. We can't give up on that as part of our message.
Thank you for your talk. I'm just in the middle of reading What Happened, and I really appreciated the chapter on idealism versus reality. Do you think there's a place almost in the whole messaging side of things for this almost unrealistic ideal when it comes to messaging and getting people excited, sort of like what Bernie Sanders succeeded in doing? It may not be rooted in realistic policy, but maybe there is a place for these very aspirational ideas. I was very cynical about this at the time, but I think my mind is changing.
Yeah, and actually Hillary says in What Happened, I'll put in a plug for What Happened, everybody should read it. You can buy it at your local bookstore or on Amazon. She says in What Happened, actually, she too has kind of thought more about this question of setting out the big, bold vision as well as having the policies to back it up. And it's kind of hard to deny that in a way, right? You saw the success of both Trump and Sanders pursuing that kind of approach. But I would put one big asterisk around the proposition that says, yes, part of this has to be setting bold visions you know you're not going to accomplish. And that is, if that's all you do, what you do is come out and say there's going to be a chicken in every pot and a job, good paying job for everyone tomorrow and all the rest of it, ultimately you are only going to feed cynicism and people sense that they're getting let down. That there has to be some connection between the aspiration you're setting out and your capacity to achieve it. And if that means saying we're ultimately going to arrive at this objective, it will take us some steps to get there, okay, that is okay to me. But making promises to people you know for a fact you cannot keep, that might be good electoral politics in some cases, but I think ultimately it degrades our democracy. So what I would argue for is finding a way to do the vision thing, as George H.W. Bush once put it. I think read off a card, this is the time to do the vision thing. But do it in a way that is sufficiently rooted in reality that you're not going to ultimately leave people with the sense that you're just basically bullshitting them.
Oh, we have.
That's good, because I didn't want to end this on bullshitting.
I'm sorry about bullshitting as well. But what I will say, if there is another question, we'll take these two together. We'll finish. Is there a last question out there? Anyone else? You're good? Okay, we do get the last one, Tasha.
Okay, so what I heard from you saying about the American dream is that it's not dead, it's not dying, but it has to be redreamt in a way. There's also a conversation saying that Trump has changed presidency, so in that context, what do they need to be rethought and redreamt about presidency?
About the American presidency? Yeah. I think a couple things on this. First, I think that there is a non-linear difference between one term and 2 terms of Trump, which is to say 2 terms of Trump is not just 2x of undermining of the institution of the American presidency, but X to the nth degree. And therefore, I think that's a complicated way of saying he can't win a second term, basically. That would be very bad, because I think it would just be exponentially worse for the institution and what it means, and an affirmation that the way he is treating the office and approaches the office is like somehow acceptable. But I think that if he is defeated next time around, actually, it will reinforce the fact that many Americans basically believe that he violated core norms of what it means to be president, about pulling people together rather than dividing them, about elevating rather than denigrating, etc. So I actually think that while I look at Trump and say, what's behind that we need to grapple with from a policy perspective, from an overall approach perspective, I am more resistant to looking at Trump and saying, how might we reimagine the presidency, because he's raising some interesting things about how it might be done differently. Because I don't find that credible. Like, I actually think this is an area where we have to say, you know what? This has been a pretty darn good institution. Not all the occupants we've agreed with or disagreed with, but it has been an institution that has operated with dignity, with authority over the course of our time, and we need to get back to that, as opposed to think, oh, you know, he's raised some really good points about 6 a.m. tweets on, you know, whatever the subject is, attacking NBA players or running feuds with television stars or so forth. That, I think, it's not, I don't there want to kind of get into the business of saying we really need, in my view, we need to restore more than reimagine. But back to the question about Twitter and reaching people and just how the world has changed, there's no doubt that the mode of professional communication in the social media age has to be carefully considered. And from that, I think we can learn lessons from Trump about how not to do it. But thinking about how to do it, that is a big question. That is different. It's not Oval Office addresses in the same way. It's not the main means of communication. So that will have to be dealt with. And then there is this larger question with Congress as paralyzed as it is about the accretion of power to the presidency. And I think that's not a good thing. But I think that predated Trump and is not centrally about Trump, but is something that over time, a rebalancing between Congress and the executive branch would be a positive thing. But you know, I'll just close by saying that I grew up in sort of at the end of the Cold War. I came of age in the 90s in the Clinton administration at a time of sort of real promise and possibility, and people who were declaring the end of history. I was in law school when 9/11 happened, and I saw all of the ways in which we reacted and overreacted to that. And through these various phases over the course of my life, you know, I've traveled the world. I've been to 120 plus countries at this point with Secretary Clinton, with Joe Biden, and on my own. And I remain somewhat unapologetic in my view that the United States can be and must be a force for good in the world, that we aren't at every moment of every day, but that there is a path back to that. It starts at home. It starts with getting our own house in order and figuring out who we are and what we stand for. And then it goes to acting responsibly and with humanity in the world. But, you know, even as someone who has now suffered or been part of a really difficult and stinging defeat last year, I retain that kind of core confidence, and we'll keep working for it. And I thank you guys for taking the time to listen to me today. I'm still trying to learn and grapple and haven't got all the answers, as you heard in spades tonight, but I'm trying at least to ask the right questions. So thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it.